I've recently had the misfortune of spending an evening with the newly released The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. And I say misfortune because there is truly no other way to describe the torture session that is this animated film, supposedly inspired by the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. To be very clear, I won't pretend a lack of bias as far as this project is concerned. I come from the school of thought that asserts Tolkien was a prolific writer of great talent, perhaps unmatched in the English canon to this day. His masterful prose cannot be replicated by subpar talent, as Amazon's The Rings of Power so aptly proves, nor can his imagination and craft be matched by the slaves of any one ideology, the best argument being the War of the Rohirrim in this case. With that in mind, I will proceed to review and analyze the lump of coal that has been left in our stockings this festive season. My main concerns will be the story and characters from a layman's perspective, seeing as I am neither a Tolkien scholar, nor in any way qualified to judge the animation on technical grounds. The commentary provided is by necessity not dreadfully groundbreaking. Please take this as the opinions of a casual Tolkien fan. Before we move on any further, I would like to stress that if you enjoyed this film, that matter lies strictly between your head and your heart. You, the viewer, can like whatever you choose to like. My opinion cannot and will not detract from that unless you yourself attempt to put your feelings aside when judging the film both on its own merit and as an adaptation of Tolkien's work. All this out of the way, the following structure will be employed. 1. The story in Tolkien's Appendices. 2. The characters in Tolkien's Appendices. 3. The story of the animated film. 4. The characters of the animated film. 5. Design choices. 6. The merits of the War of the Rohirrim as its own film. 7. The merits of the War of the Rohirrim as an adaptation. I have provided the story of Helm Hammerhand in full, so the viewer may judge for themselves whether the adaptation captures something of the professor's history of Rohan.
Of the kings of the Mark between Eol and Théoden most is said of Helm Hammerhand. He was a grim man of great strength. There was at that time a man named Freka, who claimed descent from King Freewine, though he had, men said, much Dunlendish blood, and was dark-haired. He grew rich and powerful, having wide lands on either side of the Adorn. Near its source he made himself a stronghold and paid little heed to the king. Helm mistrusted him, but called him to his councils, and he came when it pleased him. To one of these councils Freka rode with many men, and he asked the hand of Helm's daughter for his son Wolf. But Helm said, "You have grown big since you were last here, but it is mostly fat, I guess," and men laughed at that, for Freka was wide in the belt. Then Freka fell in a rage and reviled the king, and said this at the last, "Old kings that refuse a proffered staff may fall on their knees." Helm answered, "Come. The marriage of your son is a trifle. Let Helm and Freka deal with it later. Meanwhile, the king and his council have matters of moment to consider." When the council was over, Helm stood up and laid his great hand on Freka's shoulder, saying, "The king does not permit brawls in his house, but men are freer outside," and he forced Freka to walk before him out from Edoras into the field. To Freka's men that came up he said, "Be off. We need no hearers. We are going to speak of a private matter alone. Go and talk to my men." And they looked and saw that the king's men and his friends far outnumbered them, and they drew back. "Now, Dunlending," said the king, "you have only Helm to deal with, alone and unarmed. But you have said much already, and it is my turn to speak. Freka, your folly has grown with your belly. You talk of a staff. If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust on him, he breaks it." So, with that he smote Freka such a blow with his fist that he fell back stunned, and died soon after. Helm then proclaimed Freka's son and near kin the king's enemies, and they fled, for at once Helm sent many men riding to the west marches. For years later great troubles came to Rohan, and no help could be sent from Gondor, for 3 fleets of the Corsairs attacked it and there was war on all its coasts. At the same time Rohan was again invaded from the east, and the Dunlendings seeing their chance came over the Isen and down from Isengard. It was soon known that Wulf was their leader. They were in great force, for they were joined by enemies of Gondor that landed in the mouths of Lefnui and Isen. The Rohirrim were defeated and their land was overrun, and those who were not slain or enslaved fled to the dales of the mountains. Helm was driven back with great loss from the crossings of Isen and took refuge in the Hornburg and the ravine behind, which was after known as Helm's Deep. There he was besieged. Wulf took Edoras and sat in Meduseld and called himself king. There Harleth Helm's son fell, last of all, defending the doors. Soon afterwards the long winter began, and Rohan lay under snow for nearly 5 months. Both the Rohirrim and their foes suffered grievously in the cold, and in the dearth that lasted longer. In Helm's Deep there was a great hunger after Yule, and being in despair, against the king's counsel, Hammer, his younger son, led men out on a sortie and foray, but they were lost in the snow. Helm grew fierce and gaunt for famine and grief, and the dread of him alone was worth many men in the defense of the burg. He would go out by himself, clad in white, and stalk like a snow troll into the camps of his enemies, and slay many men with his hands. It was believed that if he bore no weapon would bite on him. The Dunlendings said that if he could find no food he ate men. That tale lasted long in Dunland. Helm had a great horn, and soon it was marked that before he sallied forth he would blow a blast upon it that echoed in the deep, and then so great a fear fell on his enemies that instead of gathering to take him or kill him they fled away down the Coombe. One night men heard the horn blowing, but Helm did not return. In the morning there came a sungleam, the first for long days, and they saw a white figure standing still on the dike, alone, for none of the Dunlendings dared come near. There stood Helm, dead as a stone, but his knees were unbent. Yet men said that the horn was still heard at times in the deep, and the wraith of Helm would walk among the foes of Rohan and kill men with fear. Soon after the winter broke. Then Freelaf, son of Hild, Helm's sister, came down out of Dunharrow, to which many had fled, and with a small company of desperate men he surprised Wulf in Meduseld and slew him, and regained Edoras. There were great floods after the snows, and the Vale of Entwash became a vast fen. The eastern invaders perished or withdrew, and there came help at last from Gondor, by the roads both east and west of the mountains. Before the year was ended the Dunlendings were driven out, even from Isengard, and then Freelaf became king.
Now that we have familiarized ourselves with the key aspects of this bit of narrative, it would be prudent to give some thought to the interpretive lenses which can be used in understanding the purpose and importance of the information. To some, this may be mere fiction, but to the Rohirrim, it is history. And what is history but one of the building blocks of individuality? By offering a direct link to the distant, sometimes very distant past, history provides them with the story of existence, anchoring them in the stream of time, supplying continuity, direction, and a reason to persevere, particularly to those who cherish the notion of belonging. There is power in either mode, whether one chooses to look at the episode as a story or part of history. Whatever the case, we are presented with what is a model of conduct in the male heroes of this story, whether we look to Helm's unfaltering heroism in the face of great personal loss, or if we take into account the sacrifice of Harleth and his brother, or even the desperate ride of Freelaf and his men. In some ways the story of Helm parallels that of later figures such as Theoden. They are both the last king in their specific line, losing in Helm's case both sons and in Theoden's the sole one he had. Both men endure many hardships and even crushing defeats, rallying their strength in defiance of tragedy itself and fighting to the bitter end. As a result, they are included in the pantheon of Rohan's heroes, to forever be celebrated for their personal bravery and might. In that sense, they are aspirational figures, representative of what men ought to be. The story is all the more poignant due to the fact that by the end of it Helm has died, along with his line. Yet even in death, he remains unbent. The discerning viewer will doubtless bring up the point that stories need not be trivial in the least, even if they are in themselves fiction. There is no Rohan, there never was a Helm Hammerhand. Leastwise not in what most would consider reality. But what about the reality that exists beyond our finite world? The incontrovertible reality of ideals where Helm is as real as you or I. As Dr. Jordan B. Peterson puts it, sometimes our reality is swallowed up whole by the greater, deeper reality of story.
In most cultures, music plays a very central role in identity formation. And maybe, in our tribal past, and this is highly likely, when you were being inculcated into the tribal culture, that was inculcated with dance and with masks and with music all at the same time. So you're invited to participate in this drama and to take your place in this drama, and to think of that as a representation of the objective world is just not right. That isn't what it is. It's an invitation to a drama. Now then the question might be, well, is the drama real? And the answer to that is, it depends on what you mean by real. I think that great dramas are more real than real. They're hyper real. They're hyper real because they provide guidelines about how to act that are abstract and even perhaps generic, but applicable across an extraordinary broad range of situations.
In essence, the same idea is expressed by G.K. Chesterton in his work Orthodoxy.
Tradition means giving a vote to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. All Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by the accident of death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our groom. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father.
The history of Rohan, its tradition, its great drama invites us to share in the loss and triumph of Helm. We, not unlike the Rohirrim, are meant to immerse ourselves into the song of his life and gain by it the knowledge of this facet of heroism. To let our souls be dyed with the color of this wisdom that is passed down to us, to take a leaf out of the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. With that in mind, let us go to a brief analysis of Tolkien's characters in this tale. A cursory glance over the material reveals several salient points, namely, this story is a celebration of the bravery Helm, his sons, and his nephew, Freelaf, display, as much as it is a lament for the great loss Rohan endured. Notably, though concise, this brief peek at the history of Rohan nevertheless sketches a very clear portrait of the protagonists and antagonists. There is firstly Helm. Tolkien puts emphasis on his role as the most famed king between Earl and Theoden, thereby cementing this particular man as the protagonist of what will become the tale of the War of the Rohirrim against the Dunlendings. It is important to at this point explain the chivalric tradition that gave birth to the class of figure Helm adheres to. Though he does not bear the name, Helm is in fact a knight in comport. To prove this point, I ask the viewer to consider the stark contrast between the man reigning in Meduseld and the man brawling in the courtyard, with a view towards the excellent definition of chivalry provided by C.S. Lewis.
But if we want to understand chivalry as an ideal distinct from other ideals, if we want to isolate that particular conception of the man comme il faut, which was the special contribution of the Middle Ages to our culture, we cannot do better than turn to the words addressed to the greatest of all the imaginary knights in Malory's Morte d'Arthur. "Thou wert the meekest man," says Sir Ector to the dead Launcelot. "Thou wert the meekest man that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." The important thing about this ideal is, of course, the double demand it makes on human nature. The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and the ragged stumps of lopped-off limbs. He is also a demure, almost a maiden-like, guest in hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He is not a compromise or happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth and meek to the nth. The medieval ideal brought together two things which have no natural tendency to gravitate towards one another. It brought them together for that very reason. It taught humility and forbearance to the great warrior. It demanded valor of the urbane and modest man. The man who combines both characters, the knight, is a work not of nature but of art, of that art which has human beings, instead of canvas or marble, for its medium.
Helm's actions indicate in a clear manner that while he is a tolerant man and will even go against his gut instinct if he believes a certain course of action is beneficial for his kingdom, he is still very much a king. Case in point, he does not antagonize Freke until the man himself displays a profound lack of respect, going as far as to dole out a veiled threat in the king's own hall, symbol of his status which far outstrips Freke's. Moreover, Helm shows a care for his station by not brawling with the man in his own hall. The hall is in some sense a space of wisdom, of peacemaking, and the relationship between Helm and Freke is that of a liege lord to his vassal. Freke's insult is tantamount to a challenge, one which Helm, his superior in rank, is under no obligation to accept. To argue the point with the man in such a place, during the Lord's Council, would mean to acknowledge him as an equal. Rather he takes the fight outside. This is meant to be a punishment for Freke's daring. But even there, he stops anyone else from interfering between the two, ensuring equal conditions for both sides. After delivering the killing blow, in lieu of waiting for unjust revenge, Helm chooses to declare Freke's son and kin the crown's enemies and even sends men in pursuit of them in a bid to ensure no further conflict arises. The story then takes us from his triumph over Freke to what follows, that is a rapid decline with the loss of his kingdom and his sons. Additionally, fate seems to have set itself against him, as he and his people are trapped under the dominion of winter, running low on provisions. Though grieving, Helm does not abandon the fight, but brings it to his enemies, and such is his skill that even in those harsh conditions he manages to strike fear in their hearts. Very clearly, we are looking at a brave, determined and conscientious individual whose pride matches his strength. Helm is a hero to his people precisely because he stood firm against his foe to the last. This is very much in keeping with the Anglo-Saxon sensibilities displayed in the epic poem Beowulf. The titular hero of that tale remains equally unmoved by the terror of his foe, a dragon, even knowing it means death. The fact it takes such unsurmountable foes as dragons or winter for defeat to be ensured speaks volumes as to the quality of these men. Following in the footsteps of their father, Harleth and Hammer embody the selfless giving of oneself expected in heroes when dire circumstances arise. While less space is dedicated in the narrative to fleshing them out to the same degree as their father, the snapshots chosen to encapsulate the character of these men are no less striking. Of Harleth we know he dies defending Meduseld, this last stand being poignant in its tragic outcome. The mark of heroism is inextricably tied to the individual's willingness to sacrifice for what he knows to be right. To lay down one's own life is the ultimate sacrifice in that sense and testament to the strength of one's belief. Hammer, not to be outdone, goes out into the bitter winter in search for provisions, at great personal risk. It is not due to personal greed that he does so, but for the desperate people weakened by a long siege, a people whose hope hangs upon his success. In a world that must have surely seemed to be teetering on the edge of collapse, men like Hammer kept hope alive, which is no small feat. Last but not least is Freelaf, whose stroke of good fortune in winter ending enables the triumph of Rohan over the Dunlendings. He rides down from Dunharrow, we are told, with a small company of men and regains Edoras, enacting justice upon the enemy. There is an echo in his deeds of Helm's determination, the bravery of Harleth and Hammer's hopefulness. Freelaf is the natural continuation of the heroic character propagating itself along the thousands and tens of thousands of years of storytelling. In a just world, his gaining the throne is an expected and desired outcome of defeating Rohan's enemies. On the other side of the conflict stand Freke and Wulf, defined by their greed, boldness, and lack of humility. The attitude displayed by Freke cannot be taken to be anything but threatening, considering he rides at the onset with a party of many men when intending to ask for a marriage between Helm's daughter and his son. More than that, what is implied becomes explicit once he is angered by Helm's refusal. A better standing might be afforded his son. Wulf is tied to Freka by blood, thus his need to avenge the man's death is at least understandable. That said, he chose to do so through treacherous means, attacking when Rohan had already engaged an invading party and were pressed for allies. The death of these men is warranted insofar as the story's logic is concerned when looking at the narrative as a type of morality tale. By extolling the virtue of heroic figures and damning the failings of the villains, the story fulfills more than merely the transmission of information. It embodies the ethos of the Rohirrim as a people, promoting perseverance in the face of death itself and certainly against great odds, as will later be echoed in Tolkien's main tale. While these are not the deepest characters, and how could they be given the constraints of their introduction, they nevertheless function as adequate springboards for creating depth and complexity by fleshing out their reasons, studying their mindset and investigating their feelings. Please note that the daughter, while getting a mention, is not even given a name, let alone an important role in the war. While that does not mean she could not have been incorporated into the story, going as far as making her our point of view character, such a portrayal would need to have some respect for the source material. As a preamble to the analysis of the animated adaptation, I will give some general thoughts on what has been achieved in the attempt, following which a longer discussion will occur. Seeing the war through the eyes of Helm's daughter would have provided the audience with the perfect opportunity to get into the heads and hearts of these characters, humanizing the conflict to an even greater degree. For instance, we might have answered some of the following questions. What is the daughter's opinion of Wulf as a man, a potential husband and an asset to Rohan? What does Helm's daughter think of using her marriage to end the war even at the risk of entering a union her father disdains, or that she herself has little desire for? What of her companions and the people who flee with Helm to the Hornburg? How do they feel about the situation? Does she feel any guilt for the dire situation of the Rohirrim? Is she faced with anything other than reverence from her fellow countrymen? How does she cope with the loss of her brothers? What does she do in the face of her father's decline? While the adaptation we got seems to answer some of these questions, it only ever does so in the most superficial, expedient, and predictable of ways. How does Héra feel about Wulf? Mostly pity. What does she think of marriage? In the words of Jake Snow, "I don't want it. I never have." I will be discussing the implications of this sentiment in the section dedicated to the adaptation's characters. Does she feel the slightest amount of guilt for the situation of her people? No. How does she cope with the loss of her brothers? It's really no biggie. She gets over it pretty fast while her father mopes and goes into a decline. What do her people think of her? They revere her, of course. Well, up until the point it comes to making songs about her, then her implied sexual preferences along with her insistence to live wild and free means she needs to be forgotten. Oh Rohan, you are a land of contradictions. Join me next time, as we explore the depths of ineptitude displayed in the butchering of Tolkien's lore.